Dear children, welcome to the next module on the chapter Cell, the Unit of Life. In the last classes, we had learned about the prokaryotic cells. And we know there are two types of cells, which are the prokaryotic cell and the eukaryotic cell. Now, in this module, we are going to learn about the eukaryotic cell. U stands for true and karyon means nucleus. So those organisms who are having a true nucleus are called as a eukaryotes, or they are called as eukaryotes, and such cells of the eukaryotes are called as eukaryotic cells. What are eukaryotic cells? They are having well organized nucleus. That is, the nucleus is bounded by a membrane, and also the cell organelles are also bounded by a membrane. So they are having organized membrane bound nucleus and organelles. The cell organelles are also bounded by a well organized membrane. Due to the presence of this membrane, it gives clear-cut compartmentalization of the cytoplasm. And the genetic material in the case of eukaryotic cell is organized in the form of chromosomes in which the genes are present. This figure we can see a protist cell, that is a cell of a protista, a fungal cell, a plant cell and an animal cell. All these are having a eukaryotic cell. Now, what are the cell organelles present in a eukaryotic cell? They are cell membrane, the cell wall, the endomembrane system, which is comprised of the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, lysosomes, and vacuoles. In addition to it, the other cell organelles which are not part of the endomembrane system are the mitochondria, plastids, ribosomes, cytoskeleton, cilia and flagella, centrosomes and centrioles, nucleus, and microbodies. So let us begin the eukaryotic cell section with the cell membrane. The chemical studies on human RBCs show that the cell membrane is composed of a lipid bilayer, proteins, and carbohydrates. So these three are the contents of a cell membrane or a plasma membrane. Lipids are seen in the form of two layers. So that's why it's called as a lipid bilayer. We can see these are the lipid bilayers. And the lipids, which is mainly made up of phosphoglycerides, that is glycerols with the phosphate group. The phosphoglycerols or phosphoglycerides, they have an outer polar head. This is the outer polar head. We can see on both the ends, one facing the outer environment, other facing the inner part of the cell. So outer layer is made up of polar head region. The polar head region and the inner is the hydrophobic tail. These are the tail region, the two tail regions. So the tail region, what we have to learn is hydrophobic, or it is non-polar, and whereas the polar head is hydrophilic, that is they are water loving. The head region is water loving, which is facing towards the outer environment or towards the inner side of the cell, that is towards the aqueous cytoplasm. Whereas the tail region is very well protected. It is very well protected from the aqueous layer. So the non-polar tail of saturated hydrocarbons is protected from the aqueous environment. So what do we learn so far? The cell membrane or plasma membrane is made up of three components. They are a lipid bilayer, proteins, and carbohydrates. The lipid is made up of two parts. Each lipid is nothing but it is made up of phosphoglycerides and is made up of two parts, the head and a tail region. The tail region is non-polar and it is hydrophobic, whereas the head region is hydrophilic. And the non-polar region of the tail, which is made up of saturated hydrocarbon, is protected from the aqueous environment because it is lying embedded on either side by the polar head region. The ratio of protein and lipid varies in different cells. For example, in the human RBC, the cell membrane of human RBC is having 52% of proteins and 40% of lipids. So in each cell, the variation of the proportion of the proteins to lipids varies. Based on the ease of extraction, the membrane proteins, the proteins which is present in the cell membrane, they are classified into two types. The two types of proteins are integral proteins and peripheral proteins. What is the difference between integral proteins and peripheral proteins? Integral proteins, they are partially or totally buried in the membrane. We can see this is a lipid bilayer. We can see the two layers of lipid with the polar head and the tail region. And those proteins which are partially or totally embedded within the membrane is called as integral proteins. We can see these are the integral proteins. Whereas those proteins which lie on the surface of the membrane, they are called as peripheral proteins. These are the peripheral proteins which is seen to this side. These are the peripheral proteins. So two types of proteins which is present in the membrane are the integral proteins and peripheral proteins, and this is based on the ease of extraction, how easily they can be extracted. Peripheral proteins, they lie on the surface of the membrane, whereas integral proteins, they are partially or totally embedded within the membrane. Now, in order to study the structure of the cell membrane, we have to learn about the fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane. And this fluid mosaic model of cell membrane is proposed by Singer and Nicholson in the year 1972. And according to this model, the quasi-fluid nature of lipid, what do you mean by quasi-fluid? The quasi-fluid nature means somewhat fluid and somewhat solid. That's the meaning of quasi-fluid nature. The quasi-fluid nature of lipid enables the lateral movement of proteins within the bilayer, within the lipid bilayer. It is because of this semi-solid and semi-liquid nature of the lipid bilayer, which enables the lateral movement of the proteins to and fro the cell membrane. And this ability to move within the membrane is measured as its fluidity. How far that is a measure of fluidity is given by its ability or the lateral movement of the proteins across the cell membrane. Now, the functions of this particular cell organelle, that is cell membrane or plasma membrane. It helps in the transport of molecules. The membrane is selectively permeable. It is not completely permeable. It is selectively permeable. That means it allows only certain substances or molecules to move on either side of it. Okay, so transport of the molecules, the membrane is selectively permeable to some molecules present on either side of the cell membrane. Due to the fluid nature of the cell membrane, the plasma membrane can help in cell growth. It also helps in cell growth, formation of intercellular junctions between the two neighboring cells. It helps in secretion of certain substances. Endocytosis. Endocytosis is nothing but infolding of the plasma membrane so as to form vacuoles. So that is called as cell endocytosis and cell division. So due to its fluid nature, it is helping in cell growth, formation of cellular junctions, intercellular junctions, secretion, endocytosis and cell division. Dear children, in this module, we learned that the cell membrane is made up of a lipid bilayer, proteins and carbohydrates. The lipid bilayer is again made up of two parts, the head and the tail. And based on the ease of extraction, the proteins which is embedded within the cell membrane are of two types, integral and peripheral proteins. And in order to explain the structure of the plasma membrane through the fluid mosaic model, which was proposed by Singer and Nicholson. We learned about the fluid mosaic model, which is given by Singer and Nicholson. We also learned about the functions performed by the cell membrane. Thank you.